Mordor, the land from which all Middle-earth's ills seem to seep. Bordering Harad to the south and Gondor to the west, Mordor cuts an imposing sight into the landscape, surrounded on three sides by the Ash and Shadow Mountains. To many, Mordor could be likened to a blackened scab on the face of Middle-earth, but in the south there are some more fertile lands, provided mainly from the ashen soil from the north and the inland sea from the south. While Mordor is more than just ash and scattered orc encampments and industry, much of what will be relevant here is located in its arid north. An army's entry into Mordor is only feasible through the Black Gate, with all other sides aside from the far east being blocked by mountains that are insurmountable to an army. Lying further within lies the Tower of Cirith Ungol, Sauron's Keep of Barad-dûr, and the imposing presence of Mount Doom itself. Mordor also occupy the city of Minas Morgul in the lands of Ithilien, although this is not protected by the mountain ranges which protect its innermost parts. Indeed, this mountainous protection is one of the main reasons why Mordor is not easily invaded. Even if an army is to break through the Black Gate, they are met with a land which will cause them great attrition in the shape of Gorgoroth. This allows Mordor to do what they do best, which is of course being on the offensive. Generally speaking, in a campaign, Mordor's goal is to simply advance west until no more enemies remain on your path to conquest. Of course, this sounds easier than it will actually be, but this is still a simple end goal to bear in mind. How they achieve this with regards to their units in multiplayer and single player will now be talked through.
So here we are once again on the grassy plain, having a look at Mordor. Now, starting off with the heart and soul of Mordor, which is of course your trash. You have some very familiar faces here. There's no real new units in terms of lower tier Mordor units. The new stuff that Mordor have got in Reforged comes a little bit later. A little bit more elite units that they've been given. Nonetheless, we'll go through these units anyway. The Orc Band, of course, they're the same as they always were. They are now very, very cheap indeed. But again, you know, most units have been given a buff, but the Orc Band stats are still very low. They are, of course, just there to be the first wave, if you will. Take the arrows, take the casualties, and just be that first attack that you make on enemy lines. Moving on then, we have some, again, the Orc Raiders, again, are kind of similar. They are a little bit more expensive, pushing into the 300 florins mark. Although, you know, the Orc Raiders are not a terrible unit for what they are. They are, of course, individually very bad in terms of combat, but how cheap they are means you can use them to overwhelm, and that is, of course, what Mordor are all about. In terms of strengths, they excel at being on the attack and overwhelming the enemy with sheer numbers, which these lower tier units help do in a big way. The Orc Maulers, of course, slightly better in terms of offensive capability on the charge, but they are, of course, a little bit less durable than the Orc Raiders because they lack the shields. Still, it's an option. Then we have the slightly more elite Morin Guard. We're pushing on to, possibly you could call these guys mid-tier now because we're up to the 600 florins mark. The Morin Guard, they're pretty good. They always were pretty good. I like the Morin Guard a lot because of the utility they offered Mordor. They're good against cavalry, they're pretty durable, they're good to support your trolls as they advance. And they're still all about that, you know. Very nice unit to have on side indeed. They can do shield wall now, which is good. Skiltron is a lot less common in Reforged, I've noticed. Shield wall has sort of grown in popularity, so that's nice. It's nice, very nice. The Rook units. These guys, even more so now, are going to be very important as Mordor, because some of your other higher tier units are very expensive indeed. So your Uruks are really going to be the heart and soul of your army, whether it's a low funds game, in which case the Uruks are going to be pretty high tier, or a very high funds game, in which case the Uruks are going to make up the main body of your army. And the Uruk Halberds in particular, I must say, are a very important unit for Mordor, as they are pretty much perfect for supporting a Troll's advance, or in the rare occasion that you are on the defense as Mordor, the Uruk Halberds are an ideal unit to use in their spear wall formation as your frontline defense. And of course we have the Uruks, standard Uruks. These guys still very important, your bread and butter infantry. On the attack, these guys are pretty ideal for going on the walls, in addition to some of your more elite units, so you can support your elite units with sheer numbers. They're pretty good, although I would say that because of the balance changes, they are maybe slightly worse than they were, but that's fine because they are also a bit more affordable overall, I would say, and Mordor's higher tier units in support of these guys make them overall more effective, but individually a little bit less effective perhaps. Then we have Mordor's base tier archers. Of course, the scouts make a return. They are now the worst archer units in the game, so whether you want to use them is down to you. The scouts always were a little bit too bad to use, in my opinion. Like, there's not really much more money to get some of the better archers, but they are nonetheless an option for lower funds games. And then we have the orc archers, of course, a little bit more like it. They have slightly better armor, if you can call what orcs wear armor. But, they have better missile damage, they're slightly better in melee. If you're going to have the cheaper archers, I would go for these guys over the scouts, because that little bit of extra money is worth it in the long run. They can also deploy sharpened stakes, which is always nice. And of course we have the Uruk archers, they can now also deploy stakes. This is going to be your base archers. Mordor do have some pretty good archers now, which we'll get onto when we get to the higher tier units. But the Uruk archers are still the bread and butter archers. They are reasonably priced. They won't obviously outskirmish any elven or human archers in terms of sheer skill, but in addition to the numbers of your infantry, you may be able to put enough pressure on enemy infantry lines to crack them, just by putting a little bit of extra pressure on them with some arrows. So this is the centre of your army, more or less, and that remains largely unchanged because, of course, Mordor is all about their lower tier units. But now we'll move on to some of their more interesting units that they've been given. And so, moving on to Mordor's more elite troops, and there are some usual suspects here that have returned from vanilla, but there are also a large number of new units, which are very, very interesting indeed. One of the most interesting is the first unit we'll be having a look at, and that's Sauron's Will. You may notice the unit model from Moss as being that of the Morgul Uruks. And these guys are very interesting because in terms of melee, they're pretty high damage, of course, they're two-handers. They're also kind of expensive. They're a little bit more expensive than your baseline infantry that I just showed. But Sauron's Will have a number of abilities. One is that they inspire nearby troops with their chanting, and the other is that said chanting demoralizes enemy troops. So if you combine this with the fear that some of your expensive elite troops have, this can cause enemies to break in places where their line is perhaps not so strong. That makes Sauron's Will a potentially very useful tool indeed, particularly because they're not overly expensive, as I've said. Pretty good, very interesting unit to use. They have a number of abilities. They also have a bonus at fighting in snow. Again, they're not going to really outlast some of the elite infantry of like the elves or the dwarves. They're still relatively vulnerable compared to that sort of thing. But again, they have a fair amount of numbers in their unit as well. So that means combining it with something like Uruks, they're going to be hard to chew through for quite a lot of the higher tier units. Moving on then to the Númenórean Shield Guard. These guys, of course, should be self-explanatory. They are elite spearmen. They are Númenóreans, after all. They too can form shield wall. They're essentially, elite spears. You all know what to expect from them. They'll hold the line seemingly forever. They won't do a great deal of damage, but if you can get your archers into position behind them, you'll be able to hold in a siege very nicely. This really is one of Mordor's strongest defensive units. In addition to the Uruk halberds, you're going to be seeing a lot of these guys if Mordor are on the defense. They're pretty expensive though, so you're not likely to see them on the attack because there are other units which are better on the offense, such as the Temple Berserkers, also known as dismounted Black Númenóreans. Now, if you've played custom scenarios with these guys involved before, you'll know how strong they are. They are two-handers essentially with the durability of a sword and shield unit, which makes them very, very dangerous indeed. They are, of course, very, very expensive, but they are worth it if you can field them at all. Of course, the Naz'gul return. They're pretty much the same as they always were. Very effective, provided you can embed them in a unit of much more numbers, for example, such as Uruks. If you can embed them in a unit of Uruks, or Sauron's Will would be even better now because of all the demoralization that Naz'gul and Sauron's Will can perform together. They will perform very, very well indeed. They are very expensive, so you're only ever going to see one in a Mordor army. But yeah, you know what to expect from the Naz'gul by now. There are the Mountain Trolls, of course, the lower tier trolls that Mordor have to offer. In a lower funds game, you're likely to see the Mountain Trolls. A little bit more vulnerable than other types of trolls, but they are still capable of wreaking havoc in the enemy lines. Moving on to the Morgul Chosen. Now this is a very elite unit again. Similar to the Númenórean Shield Guard, they're a little bit more expensive, a little bit more elite. Looks like they've got a skeleton, almost cartoonish skeleton even on their shields. In terms of unit model, they look very similar to the Guards of Orthanc that Isengard have, only they are orcs under their blackened armour. Very nice looking unit, very strong, very sturdy. Again, you know, they're spears, you know what to expect from spears. These guys, very good spears indeed. Then of course, a real favourite for anyone who plays Mordor, that is the Olag High, the armoured trolls. Still, just you're very likely to see these guys if Mordor are on the attack because they're just so difficult to deal with. Pikes and very high tier two-hander units are really the only thing that can efficiently take down Olag High. These guys, first line in, supported with Uruk halberds or Morin on guard, or if they're on the walls, a unit of Uruks. Very difficult to stop indeed. Very difficult. Still as good as they always were. Now for Mordor's archers. Mordor's archers were always a point where they fell down really in vanilla, but that is not the case anymore. Indeed, it's far from the case, because the Númenórean Shadow Guard have a missile score of 13, and the top that you can get in this mod is 15, so they are damned close to being on par with some of the best archers. They are pretty expensive, but nonetheless, if you can support your vast infantry line with archers such as these, you're going to be onto a winner. And if you want to go one step further, you have the Temple Guard, or Black Númenórean archers. Not only do these guys have the same missile damage as the Númenórean Shadow Guard, but they have better armor, and they have 2 hit points. They are very difficult to take down. In many ways, these guys are like a Elven tier archer. They are, of course, they do, of course, have the price to match that. They're very, very expensive. So you probably won't be seeing these guys. You're probably more likely to see a Black Númenórean unit with some sort of melee capabilities. So you're probably more likely to see the Shadow Guard, but nonetheless, you might want to be preparing yourself for a good skirmish tussle with Mordor from now on. Now we have the mounted Númenórean Shield Guard. Again, these guys are a more of a melee cavalry. So their utility is questionable because shock cavalry is where it's at. But nonetheless, Mordor now have a cavalry force as well, which will give many of the Kingdoms of Men pause. So a lot of Mordor's weaknesses have honestly been patched over. They do still kind of have these weaknesses because you'll never have enough money to field all of these new units, so you won't be able to field all their good cavalry, all their good infantry, and all their good archers in addition to their monsters. But nonetheless, it is an option that you're going to have to prepare yourself for with Mordor now. And then of course we have the Temple Inquisitors. These guys are essentially the Black Númenóreans, returning unit, same as they always were, very deadly, cause fear, awful to deal with in melee. And of course we now have the mounted Naz'gul. Interesting unit, although I would say that it's probably more likely you'll see them on foot, because on horseback they are more likely to single out, whereas if you embed them in a unit of infantry they're a little bit more difficult to get to, a little bit more effective. Nonetheless, mounted Naz'gul are a very cool looking unit regardless of anything else. And then we have Black Númenóreans on wargs. So these guys have got 3 hit points, and they're on wargs, which means they have a bonus to cavalry. Pretty interesting unit, honestly. I still would think that the regular Black Númenórean unit is probably a little bit better, but the fact that wargs are now somewhat useful is another thing that Mordor have in their favour. And of course, I have brought along the Troll Catapult. I didn't bring along the Catapult and Ballista because pretty much every faction has them. The Troll Catapult is something that the Orcs have all to themselves. And it's worth saying that the Troll Catapult, in terms of melee, the Trolls aren't really as good as the Mountain Trolls or the Olag High. They are going to be chewed up by some of the more elite infantry, but just the fact that you can have an extra unit of trolls to charge in and break enemy lines is something that Mordor has at their disposal. And so that is Mordor. Their strengths are always going to be the same, very aggressive, overwhelming numbers, with their elite units being what tips the balance in terms of the fight, and that won't really change. Mordor's weaknesses have been patched over, but a lot of their high tier units are still very expensive, so you're not going to be able to field all of them, and that's really where their weakness lies. You've got a game of rock, paper, scissors going on where you need to choose what is best to deal with the opponent at hand. And you won't always get that right, but as Mordor you'll probably be using them as offensive siege factions most of the time. So with that, you're going to be using your Olag High in addition to some of your elite infantry, in addition to a lot of trash. And that's what I foresee you using Mordor as. So, that was Mordor, the new and improved Mordor.
On your path to conquest as Mordor, you will have many foes, the first of which lies immediately to your west. The men of Gondor may have fallen from grace somewhat in more recent years, approaching the War of the Ring, but they are nonetheless still a sturdy opposition for Sauron to overcome. But that will be a story for another day.